Hello there, and welcome to the Sleepy History Channel. Tonight, we are setting sail across the calm, rhythmic waves of the northern seas, embarking on a gentle journey back in time to the age of the Viking voyagers. As you settle in and let your eyes grow heavy, we will slowly drift through 100 quiet, fascinating facts about these legendary seafarers. We will leave behind the loud battles and chaotic raids often depicted in modern tales, and instead, we will focus on the quiet moments of their incredible journeys. We will stand beside them on the wooden decks of their masterful ships, listen to the wind catching in their woven sails, and watch the stars slowly wheeling overhead as they navigated the vast, uncharted waters of the medieval world. Let the sound of the ocean gently carry you away as we begin our voyage. Our first quiet truth about the Norsemen lies deep within the silent, frost-kissed forests of Scandinavia, long before a ship ever touched the water. The creation of a Viking longship was an incredibly slow, deliberate, and masterful process of woodworking that required a deep understanding of nature. Master shipbuilders did not simply chop down wood and force it into a shape. Instead, they walked through the quiet woods for days, searching for the perfect oak trees that already possessed the natural curves they needed for the hull. They looked for branches that grew in the exact shape of a ship's rib, knowing that the natural grain of the wood was far stronger than anything carved by force. When the tree was felled, the echoing thud through the quiet forest marked the birth of a vessel that would one day dance upon the waves. The wood was split into long, thin planks using wedges and axes, never sawn, which preserved the unbroken fibers of the timber, allowing the wood to remain flexible and strong. As the ship slowly took shape on the sandy shores of a quiet fjord, the air would be filled with the rich, earthy scent of pine tar. This dark, sticky resin was carefully brushed over every inch of the overlapping wooden planks to seal the hull and protect it from the biting salt of the sea. The overlapping method, known as clinker building, meant that the ship did not fight the waves, but rather flexed and glided over them, moving with the breath of the ocean like a living creature. Iron rivets were hammered into place, creating a steady, rhythmic clinking sound that echoed across the water, a lullaby of craftsmanship. Between the wooden planks, the builders stuffed animal hair or wool mixed with the sticky pine tar, creating a watertight seal that would keep the cold, dark ocean safely on the outside. The second remarkable detail of their voyaging lies in the great sails that powered these wooden beasts. We often imagine these ships gliding effortlessly, but the creation of a single sail took longer than the construction of the entire wooden ship. In the warm, fire-lit longhouses, during the long, dark winters, women spent countless hours spinning and weaving coarse wool to create the massive, square sails. The rhythmic clacking of the loom was a constant heartbeat in the village. Once the heavy woolen fabric was woven, it was treated with a thick layer of animal fat, usually from sheep or sometimes horse mane, which created a natural, waterproof barrier against the heavy ocean spray and rain. When raised on the tall wooden mast, these heavy, oiled sails would catch the morning breeze, with a deep, satisfying snap, pulling the ship forward into the morning mist. Our third sleepy fact brings us out onto the open water, where the true skill of the Viking navigator shone in the quietest of ways. Long before the invention of the magnetic compass, Norse sailors found their way across the featureless grey expanse of the North Atlantic, using only their keen senses and an intimate connection with the natural world. A seasoned navigator could stand at the bow of the ship, close his eyes, and simply feel the changing temperature of the air and the water on his skin, knowing when they were crossing into a new ocean current. They would listen closely to the sound of the waves striking the hull as the pitch and rhythm changed when they entered shallower waters near hidden coastlines. They would even lean over the edge and taste the ocean spray, knowing that the water grew less salty as they approached the mouth of Sea Freshwater River on a distant shore. Perhaps the most magical of their navigational tools is our fourth quiet detail, the legendary sunstone. In the northern latitudes, the sea is often swallowed by thick, grey fog, and the sun can remain hidden behind a blanket of thick clouds for days at a time. To find their direction in this muted, grey world, the Norsemen used a piece of naturally occurring crystal, often believed to be Icelandic spar. When held up to the cloudy sky, this milky, translucent stone possessed the unique ability to polarize light. As the navigator slowly turned the stone in his rough, weathered hands, the crystal would suddenly catch the hidden light of the sun, glowing, faintly, but clearly, in the exact direction of the hidden star. It was a quiet moment of magic on the open sea, a secret shared between the sailor, the stone, and the sky, allowing them to maintain their course through the thickest, sleepiest fogs of the north, as night gently fell over the ocean, bringing our fifth fact, the reality of sleeping on an open, wooden deck under the vast cosmos, becomes apparent. There were no cabins on a Viking longship, no soft beds hidden beneath the deck. When the stars emerged like scattered diamond dust across the black canopy of the night, the sailors sought rest exactly where they worked. They used large, leather sleeping bags called hudfat, which were often made from sealskin or cowhide. 2 or 3 men would crawl into one of these large leather envelopes, sharing their body heat against the biting chill of the ocean wind, with the rhythmic, rocking motion of the ship beneath them, and the hypnotic, repetitive sound of the water sloshing against the wooden hull. They would close their eyes. The sea itself became a giant, gently swaying cradle, singing them into a deep and dreamless sleep, completely trusting their lives to the wooden planks they had crafted with their own hands. When morning finally broke, across the endless expanse of water, painting the sky in soft shades of lavender and bruised pink, the crew would awaken to the quiet realities of their daily survival. This brings us to our sixth fascinating detail of their journey: the humble, silent meals shared upon the restless ocean. Cooking over an open flame was entirely impossible on a wooden ship swaying violently in the wind, and so the seafarers relied heavily on food that had been carefully preserved during the long months on land. The most important of these provisions was known as stockfish. These were cod or ling that had been caught in the icy northern waters and hung on massive wooden racks in the freezing winter air until they were entirely dried by the biting wind. The drying process left the fish as hard as a wooden plank, preserving it perfectly for years without the need for salt. To eat it, the sailors would sit in a quiet circle on the deck, slowly chewing on the tough, fibrous strips, allowing their natural saliva to slowly rehydrate the meat. It was a slow, meditative meal, accompanied by flat, dense wheels of barley bread that had been baked hard over the hearthstones back home, designed to withstand the dampness of the ocean air without molding. To wash down these dry, salty rations, we turn to our seventh fact, the careful preservation of fresh water. In the deep, rounded belly of the ship, beneath the resting feet of the crew, sat heavy wooden casks bound in thick iron hoops. These barrels were filled with water drawn from clear, cold mountain streams before they ever left the shore. Over the weeks and months at sea, the water would slowly take on the rich, earthy taste of the oak and pine barrels, a constant, subtle reminder of the forests they had left behind. Drinking was not done hastily, but with careful, measured respect. A sailor would gently lower a carved wooden ladle into the dark, echoing barrel, the soft splash resonating through the hull, and bring the cool, wood-scented water to his lips. In this quiet, shared ritual, every drop was precious, and the simple act of quenching one's thirst became a moment of silent gratitude to the natural world that sustained them. Yet, the ocean is a place of ever-changing moods, and our eighth quiet truth reveals what happened when the wind simply decided to stop. There were days when the heavy woolen sails hung completely motionless against the tall mast, and the sea turned as smooth and reflective as a polished silver mirror. In these moments of profound, unsettling stillness, the true physical endurance of the Norsemen was tested. The ship was equipped with long, slender oars carved from strong, flexible ash wood. When the command was given, the men would take their places on small wooden sea chests that doubled as rowing benches. They rowed not with frantic haste, but with a deep, slow, hypnotic rhythm. A designated timekeeper would often chant a low, steady cadence or strike a wooden block, creating a heartbeat for the ship. The long oars dipped into the glassy water with a synchronized, gentle splash, pulling backward to create small, swirling whirlpools that trailed behind them in the quiet, misty air. For hours on end, the only sounds were the breathing of the men, the creak of the wooden oarlock, and the steady, rhythmic splash of the ash blades, pulling them ever closer to the unknown horizon. Our ninth detail introduces an unexpected and utterly charming passenger that often joined these hardened men on their perilous journeys. Hidden among the cargo, sleeping soundly atop a pile of rough spun wool, or curled inside a coiled hemp rope, you would almost always find a ship's cat. These were not the delicate house cats of the southern empires, but the robust, thick-coated Norwegian forest cat, known as the skogcat. They possessed double-layered coats of long, water-resistant fur, tufted ears that kept out the biting wind, and large, wide paws perfectly suited for keeping their balance on a rolling deck. Their presence on board was not merely for companionship, but for the crucial, silent duty of protecting the ship's vital grain stores and ropes from stowaway mice and rats. As the sailors rowed or navigated through the freezing mists, the soft, rumbling purr of the skokkat provided a surprising source of comfort, a small, warm reminder of the hearths and homes they had left far behind in the fjords. The cargo that these feline guardians protected brings us to our 10th fact, revealing that the Viking world was built far more on trade than on conquest. While history loves to remember the sleek, terrifying warships, the vast majority of Norse voyages were undertaken in entirely different vessels, called nars. These ships were the gentle, heavy draft horses of the sea. They were built much wider, deeper, and slower than the warships, designed to sit low and heavy in the water, their massive bellies filled with the quiet wealth of the north. They moved with a slow, wallowing grace, undisturbed by the rougher waves. Inside their deep hulls lay stacks of thick, luxurious furs from the Arctic foxes and bears, massive, pale tusks of walrus ivory, wrapped carefully in leather, and heavy wooden chests filled with golden chunks of raw amber gathered from the shores of the Baltic Sea. The merchants who sailed these nars were patient, calculating men, seeking not battles, but the quiet exchange of goods in distant, bustling markets, bringing the treasures of the frozen north to the rest of the medieval world. Our 11th fact examines the meticulous layers of warmth that kept these men alive when the ocean winds turned violently cold. To survive weeks exposed to the freezing rain and sea spray, the Norsemen relied on an ancient, time-consuming method of creating textiles known as nail-binding. Long before knitting was invented, women back in the villages used a single, flat wooden or bone needle to carefully loop and knot thick woolen yarn into incredibly dense, warm garments. They crafted thick mittens, heavy hats, and long, sturdy socks using this method. Because nail-binding created a series of interlocking knots, the fabric would not unravel, even if a thread was snagged or cut on a sharp piece of rigging. The wool itself retained its natural lanolin, a greasy substance produced by the sheep, which meant that even when the socks and mittens were soaking wet from the ocean spray, they still trapped the body's heat, keeping the sailors' hands and feet remarkably warm. The silent, meticulous knotting done by the women, by the firelight, directly ensured the survival of the men out on the darkest, coldest waters, and as they sailed further north and west, toward the legendary lands of Iceland and Greenland, they encountered our 12th sleepy fact, the haunting, silent giants of the deep. Navigating the North Atlantic meant crossing paths with massive fields of sea ice and towering icebergs. For a sailor accustomed to reading the water, the approach of an iceberg was often felt before it was seen. The air temperature would drop suddenly, carrying a distinctly bitter, biting chill that seeped into their bones. Then, slowly emerging from the thick ocean fog, a towering cathedral of ancient, compressed ice would appear, glowing with a soft, ethereal blue light from within. The Norse navigators treated these silent leviathans with a deep, cautious respect. They would steer the wooden longships in a wide, gentle arc around the ice, listening intently to the terrifying, echoing cracks and deep, resonant groans that the icebergs made as they shifted and melted in the ocean currents. In these moments, the sailors felt unimaginably small, gliding silently past mountains of ice that dwarfed their wooden ships, a quiet testament to the overwhelming power and majesty of the natural world they sought to explore. As they left the towering cathedrals of ice behind, the vast emptiness of the open ocean stretched out before them once again, leading us to our 13th quiet fact about their ingenious methods of finding hidden shores. When the ocean currents offered no secrets, and the horizon was swallowed by a seamless grey haze, the Norse navigators turned to the wisdom of the raven, housed in small, carefully woven willow cages near the stern of the ship. These incredibly intelligent black birds were treated with the utmost respect and care. When a captain suspected that land was near, but could not see it through the thick sea fret, he would gently open the woven door and release one of the ravens. A profound silence would fall over the wooden deck as every sailor stopped their work. Leaning on their oars or resting against the cargo, their eyes entirely fixed on the dark silhouette ascending into the pale sky. The raven would spiral upwards, catching the high ocean drafts, seeking a higher vantage point. If the bird circled for a few moments, and then gently fluttered back down to the familiar safety of the mast, the crew knew with certainty that there was no land in sight. But if the raven caught sight of a distant coastline, it would set its wings and fly in a straight, unwavering line toward the unseen shore. The navigator would immediately align the heavy wooden tiller with the bird's flight path, trusting their lives to the keen eyes of their winged companion as it vanished into the mist. While the ocean they traveled was often a muted canvas of grey waves and white fog, our 14th detail reveals that the world of the Voyagers was surprisingly rich in colour. Modern tales often dress these seafarers in dull brown leathers and drab, dirty wool, but the reality was far more vibrant. When they were not battling the harsh elements in their heavy oiled outer gear, the Norsemen loved to wear garments dyed in deep, earthy hues. Back in the bustling villages, women would spend days boiling massive iron cauldrons over roaring fires, extracting rich natural dyes from the landscape. They gathered the roots of the madder plant to produce a warm, brick red, and harvested woad to create a deep, calming ocean blue. Weld was boiled to extract bright, cheerful yellows. Out on the open water, the salt and the harsh sun would slowly fade these beautiful colors, turning the bright reds to soft, muted roses, and the deep blues to the pale color of the winter sky. Yet, even in their faded state, these colorful woolen tunics and cloaks provided a quiet reminder of the blooming meadows and rich earth of their homelands, bringing a touch of warmth to the stark, endless expanse of the sea. During the long, slow days, when the wind was steady and the ship required little attention, the men engaged in our 15th quiet fact, the meticulous artistry of wood carving. An ocean voyage involved countless hours of simple waiting. To pass the time and keep their hands busy, a sailor would often pull a small piece of soft birch or linden wood from his leather pouch, along with a finely sharpened, single-edged iron knife. sitting cross-legged on the wooden deck, enveloped by the rhythmic sound of the waves. He would begin to slowly shave away the wood. The fragrant scent of fresh wood shavings would briefly overpower the pervasive smell of salt and pine tar. They did not just carve simple tools, they created intricate masterpieces. They carved the sweeping, interlocking vines and mythical gripping beasts of the ancient Norse art styles into the handles of their wooden spoons, the rims of their eating bowls, and even the everyday wooden pins used to secure their tents. This slow, meditative act of creation was a deeply calming practice, transforming ordinary objects into beautiful personal treasures, while the miles of ocean slowly rolled by beneath them. This focus on personal care brings us directly to our 16th fascinating detail, shattering the widespread myth of the unkempt, dirty barbarian. In truth, the Norse seafarers were surprisingly dedicated to their personal hygiene, even in the difficult conditions of an open longship. Every man carried a small, carefully crafted grooming kit hanging from his leather belt, or safely tucked into his personal wooden chest. The most prized possession within these kits was a beautifully carved comb, usually made from the dense antlers of reindeer or red deer. The teeth of these combs were cut with incredible precision, designed to easily untangle hair that had been whipped by the fierce ocean winds. In the quiet, still moments of the early morning, as the sun slowly burned away the sea mist, the deck would be filled with men, meticulously combing the salt and tangles out of their long hair and thick beards. They also carried small ear spoons carved from bone and tiny iron tweezers. This daily ritual of washing their faces with a small, precious splash of fresh water and carefully grooming their hair was not an act of vanity, but a necessary discipline to keep the skin healthy and prevent sores from the harsh, biting salt of the sea air. Our 17th quiet fact immerses us in the unique auditory landscape of the longship, a complex symphony of sounds that every sailor had to learn by heart. To a passenger, the sounds of a Viking ship might simply be noise, but to a seasoned Norseman, the ship was constantly speaking to them. The overlapping oak planks of the clinker-built hull did not just deflect the waves. They absorbed the energy of the water, groaning and creaking with a specific pitch that told the crew exactly how much stress the wood was under. The thick walrus hide ropes securing the heavy mast would hum with a low, resonant vibration when the wind was strong, and a sudden change in that hum could warn the navigator of an approaching squall before the clouds even darkened. A sailor trying to sleep inside his leather sleeping bag could feel the vibrations of the hull through his back, subconsciously monitoring the health of the vessel. If a wooden peg began to loosen, or if a specific rope started to fray, the subtle shift in the ship's song would immediately wake an experienced crewman, prompting him to quietly make his way across the dark deck to fix the issue before it became a disaster. They were deeply, intimately connected to the wooden beast that carried them, listening to its breath and bones as if it were a living, breathing companion on the lonely sea. The passage of time on such a lonely sea brings us to our 18th fact: the slow, natural way these voyagers tracked their days. Without the use of mechanical clocks or hourglasses, when land was out of sight, and the sky was a featureless grey canopy for days on end, time seemed to stretch and warp. The Norsemen relied on the profound rhythms of the natural world. They tracked the passing of weeks by the slow, changing phases of the moon, watching the silver crescent slowly swell to a full, luminous orb that cast a pale, ghostly path across the black ocean at night. During the day, if the sun managed to break through the clouds, they utilized a simple but ingenious tool known as a sun shadow board. This was a flat wooden disc, carefully carved with notches around its edge, with a central wooden pin sticking straight up. The navigator would float this wooden disc in a shallow bowl of water to keep it perfectly level, despite the rolling of the ship. As the sun slowly moved across the sky, the shadow cast by the central pin would creep across the carved notches. It was a slow, silent clock powered entirely by the heavens, allowing the navigator to carefully track their course and ensuring that the quiet, relentless passage of time never went completely unnoticed in the vast emptiness of the ocean. As the sun cast its final, elongated shadows across that floating wooden disc, the transition from day to night brought about our 19th quiet fact: the incredibly careful management of the ship's most dangerous necessity: fire. To bring an open flame onto a wooden vessel that was heavily coated in highly flammable pine tar and sealed with animal fat was a terrifying risk. Yet, the deep, biting cold of the northern oceans sometimes made a small fire absolutely essential for survival. The Norsemen did not light fires directly on the wooden deck. Instead, they utilized a heavy, forged iron cauldron, or a specially constructed deep wooden box, which was meticulously lined with a thick, insulating layer of cold beach, sand and smooth river stones brought from home. This portable hearth was placed in the most stable, sheltered section of the hull. A designated fire watcher, chosen for his unwavering focus and steady hands, would strike a piece of high-carbon steel against a sharp flint, catching the precious, tiny sparks in a piece of dried bracket fungus. He would gently cup the glowing ember, blowing on it with a soft, steady breath, until a small, controlled flame was born. This fire was never allowed to roar. It was kept incredibly small, just enough to heat an iron tool for a quick repair, or to warm a single, shared pot of heavily salted broth on a freezing night. The fire watcher never took his eyes off the dancing orange light, his silent vigilance standing between the crew and disaster, until the embers were safely smothered with wet sand. The ever-present dampness that necessitated that fire leads us into our 20th detail: the constant, rhythmic, and entirely unglamorous task of bailing water. No matter how perfectly a longship was crafted, the overlapping oak planks of the clinker-built hull were designed to flex and twist with the ocean waves. This incredible flexibility, which kept the ship from snapping in heavy storms, also meant that small amounts of seawater were constantly seeping in through the seams to keep the vessel sitting high and light on the water. The crew engaged in a never-ending, meditative battle against the creeping ocean. They used a specialized, hand-carved wooden scoop known as an auskerry. Taking turns in long, quiet shifts, a sailor would sit on stand in the lowest part of the bilge, plunging the auskerry into the pooling seawater and tossing it over the wooden rail. The sound of bailing was a constant, underlying rhythm of the voyage, the soft scraping of the wooden scoop against the floorboards, followed by the wet splash of water returning to the sea, became as familiar as the beating of their own hearts, a quiet testament to their persistent survival. When the wooden hull required more than just bailing, we discover our 21st quiet fact, the essential role of the ship's carpenter and his heavy, waterproof leather satchel. The sea is an unforgiving environment that constantly wears away at wood, iron, and rope. A voyage of several weeks required constant, silent mending to keep the vessel seaworthy. The ship's carpenter was a master of improvisation, working not in a quiet, stable workshop, but on a moving, rolling deck surrounded by freezing spray. His satchel contained small, vital treasures: spare iron rivets, square metal plates known as roves, wooden wedges carved from hard ash, and small pots of sticky pine tar. If a rivet snapped under the immense pressure of a storm, the carpenter would not wait for a calm day to fix it. Wedged tightly between the wooden ribs of the ship, to keep his balance, he would carefully tap a new iron rivet into place, the sharp, rhythmic ringing of his hammer cutting through the howling wind. It was a slow, meticulous process, ensuring that the living, breathing wooden creature beneath them remained strong enough to carry them home. This constant need for repair extended beyond the ship itself, bringing us to our 22nd sleepy detail: the nightly care of their own rugged garments, particularly their shoes. Standing in pools of salty bilge water and enduring the relentless ocean rain took a heavy toll on leather. The Norsemen wore simple, soft leather boots known as turn shoes, which were sewn inside out and then pulled right side out to hide and protect the delicate stitching. To keep their feet from freezing, the leather had to be constantly maintained. In the quiet, dark hours of the evening, as the ship sailed smoothly under the stars, sailors would sit on their wooden sea chests, holding lumps of solid beeswax or small pouches of seal fat. With slow, circular motions, they would painstakingly rub the natural oils deep into the wet leather of their shoes. The heat from their rough hands would slowly melt the wax, forcing it into the pores of the animal skin, recreating a waterproof barrier against the next day's endless moisture. It was a quiet, personal chore, a moment of peaceful reflection, while keeping their most vital gear ready for the harsh realities of the morning. Even with warm feet and a sturdy ship, the relentless, rolling motion of the ocean swells deeply affected the men, revealing our 23rd fact regarding their quiet use of herbal remedies. The hardened warriors of the North were not immune to the terrible, draining nausea of seasickness. When the ocean grew angry and the longship pitched violently up and down the massive grey swells, for days at a time, many sailors suffered in silence. To combat this, they relied on small pouches of dried herbs and roots, carefully packed by the women in their villages. They would slowly chew on pieces of dried angelica root, known for its sharp, bitter taste that helped settle a churning stomach. Others carried small bits of dried ginger, acquired through long, complex trade routes from the east, treating it as a rare and precious medicine. In the darkest, most miserable nights of a storm, a sailor might quietly pass a piece of bitter root to a pale, shivering companion. It was an unspoken gesture of profound brotherhood, a tiny comfort, shared in the overwhelming darkness of a hostile sea. When the storm finally passed and the water calmed, the men sought comfort not just for their bodies, but for their minds, which brings us to our 24th detail: the hypnotic, soothing power of skaldic poetry. In an age without books, and on a dark ocean where the only entertainment was the sound of the wind, the spoken word held immense, almost magical power. When the sails were set and the night was peaceful, the crew would gather in the center of the ship, lying on their leather sleeping bags under the vast canopy of stars. A designated skald, a master of poetry and memory, would begin to speak. He did not shout, but rather spoke in a low, rhythmic, almost chanting cadence that perfectly matched the slow rolling of the ship. He recited massive, incredibly complex poems that had been memorized perfectly over generations. These sagas told of ancient gods, legendary heroes, and, most importantly, the heroic journeys of ancestors who had sailed these exact same waters long before them. The intricate rhymes and repeating verses served as a lullaby for the exhausted men, as the skald's deep voice washed over them, weaving tales of familiar landscapes and comforting traditions. The sailors would slowly close their eyes, allowing the ancient words to anchor their minds, while the deep, black ocean gently rocked them to sleep. As the ancient sagas faded into the rhythmic washing of the waves, and the sailors slipped into deep, restorative sleep, the quietest hours of the night slowly crept over the ocean. This peaceful transition brings us to our 25th quiet fact, revealing the delicate way these rugged men harvested water from the very air around them. When morning finally approached, the ocean was often blanketed in a thick, heavy sea mist. Before the sun could rise and burn it away, this mist would settle heavily over the sleeping ship, coating the thick wooden mast, the resting oars, and the heavy woolen sails in a thick layer of morning dew. Upon waking, before any other chore was begun, the sailors engaged in a silent, meticulous harvest. They would take small, clean pieces of tightly woven linen that they kept specifically for this purpose, carefully wiping down the wooden rails and the broad surfaces of the oars to soak up the condensation. They would then wring the heavy, wet fabric out into small, hand-carved wooden bowls. In an environment where every drop of fresh water in their barrels was carefully rationed, this cold, pure dew provided a refreshing, unexpected morning drink, tasting faintly of the salty ocean air and the sweet scent of the pine tar that coated the wood. With the morning mist slowly clearing and the ship gently bobbing in the calm dawn waters, the crew would turn to our 26th detail, the deeply meditative practice of line fishing. While their heavy nars were filled with dried stockfish and barley bread, the opportunity to catch fresh sustenance was never ignored. They did not use the massive, heavy nets of later centuries, which would have been impossible to manage on a crowded, moving deck. Instead, They relied on incredibly simple, beautifully crafted handlines. A sailor would uncoil a long, thin fishing line, carefully braided from coarse horsehair or twisted bast fibers. At the very end of this line hung a hook, completely devoid of iron. It was painstakingly carved from the dense bone of a deer or a sheep, polished smooth to slip easily into the water, and weighted with a small, round beach stone. Baiting the hook with a scrap of dried meat or a glittering piece of fish skin, the sailor would gently lower it over the side of the wooden hull, watching it disappear into the murky, dark green depths. He would then sit quietly for hours, his rough, calloused fingers resting lightly on the braided hair, waiting to feel the subtle, sudden tug of a cod or a haddock. A quiet game of patience, played between the man on the surface and the unseen life swimming far below. While one man watched the dark water, others attended to the vital lifelines of the ship, bringing us to our 27th sleepy fact concerning the incredible materials used for the ship's rigging. The ropes that held the massive mast and the heavy woolen sails were not made of simple hemp, which would quickly rot and snap in the freezing, damp conditions of the North Atlantic. Instead, the Norsemen relied on swathrape, an incredibly strong, durable rope made directly from the tough hides of walruses. Creating these ropes was a massive undertaking back home, requiring the thick hide to be carefully cut into one continuous spiraling strip, which was then stretched, dried, and heavily braided. Out on the open ocean, these thick, leathery cables required constant care to remain supple. A sailor would sit on the deck with a small pot of rendered seal fat, slowly and rhythmically working the heavy grease into the braided hide with his bare hands. The repetitive, sliding motion of his hands over the thick ropes, accompanied by the low, squeaking sound of the leather stretching, was a soothing, necessary chore that kept the ropes flexible enough to be tied and untied by frozen hands in the middle of a pitch-black storm. When the maintenance of the ship was complete, the quiet hours of a calm afternoon allowed for moments of deep personal reflection, revealing our 28th fact about the tiny, hidden treasures the men carried with them. Deep within their personal wooden sea chests, beneath the heavy layers of spare wool and carefully wrapped iron tools, almost every sailor kept a small token of the home they had left behind. Often, this was a tiny, roughly carved wooden toy, perhaps a small horse or a miniature boat made by a child, and pressed into their rough hand just before the ship pushed off from the rocky shore. Alongside these wooden trinkets, they might keep a small, tightly bound bundle of dried meadowsweet or yarrow, picked from the summer fields of their village. When the endless grey of the ocean became overwhelming, a sailor would quietly open his chest, pull out the small wooden toy, and hold it gently in his palm. He would raise the dried flowers to his nose, closing his eyes as the sweet, dusty scent of the earth instantly transported him away from the harsh, biting salt of the sea and back to the warm, green valleys of his homeland. It was a private, silent moment of homesickness, a delicate vulnerability, safely hidden away within the hearts of these hardened voyagers. This deep connection to the natural world was not just a memory, but a constant, vital part of their journey, leading us to our 29th detail regarding their reliance on the graceful hunters of the sky. As the ship sailed further out into the deep ocean, the sudden appearance of seabirds was closely monitored, none more so than the spectacular northern gannet. These large, elegant birds, with their stark white bodies and pale yellow heads, were masters of the open ocean. A sailor, resting against the wooden rail, would watch in quiet awe as a gannet circled high above the grey waves. Suddenly, the bird would fold its long wings tightly against its body, transforming into a living, feathered arrow and plunge straight down into the freezing water with a sharp, clean splash. The men did not hunt these birds. They revered them as winged guides. A congregation of diving gannets meant a massive school of fish was swimming just beneath the surface, which in turn told the navigator about the unseen temperatures and ocean currents flowing far below the hull. The graceful, silent dive of the bird was a comforting sign of life in the vast, empty expanse, an unspoken confirmation that the ocean was providing exactly as the natural world intended. When the heavy clouds finally broke and the sun poured down onto the wet wooden deck, the crew partook in our 30th quiet fact, the deeply satisfying ritual of sunning the ship. After days of endless mist, rain, and freezing ocean spray, everything on board would become soaked with a heavy, pervasive dampness that seeped into the men's bones. The arrival of a clear, bright sun was a reason for quiet, methodical celebration. The sailors would immediately untie their heavy, sodden sleeping bags and drape the wet leather across the resting wooden oars. They would peel off their damp outer woolen tunics and lay them carefully over the ship's rails, exposing every possible surface to the warm rays of the sun. The entire ship would slowly transform into a floating, colorful laundry line. As the hot sun beat down on the damp wool and oiled leather, the air would fill with a dense, rich aroma of warming pine tar, melting beeswax, and drying sheep's wool. The men would sit, entirely still on their wooden benches, in nothing but their thin linen undertunics, closing their eyes, tilting their heads back, and simply absorbing the heat, letting the sun slowly bake the cold dampness out of their tired bodies, while the gentle, rhythmic rocking of the ship lulled them into a state of profound, peaceful relaxation. As the golden warmth of the afternoon eventually yielded to the creeping violet shadows of dusk, the quietest and most awe-inspiring shift on the longship began, bringing us to our 31st fact: the silent reliance on the night sky. When the sun dipped completely below the horizon, painting the ocean in deep, inky shades of obsidian and indigo, the navigator was left in darkness. Without the sun's shadow board to guide him, he turned his eyes upward to the vast, glittering canopy of the cosmos. The Norsemen had an intimate, spoken map of the stars, but one star held their absolute devotion. They called it Leiðarstjarna, the guiding star, which we know today as the North Star. A seasoned sailor would stand motionless at the heavy wooden tiller for hours, his neck tilted back, feeling the cold night air against his face, keeping that single, unmoving point of light perfectly aligned with the carved dragon head at the bow of the ship. The silence of the midnight watch was profound. The rest of the crew slumbered in their leather bags beneath him, leaving the navigator alone in a quiet, cosmic dance with the heavens, trusting the ancient, burning lights above to pull them safely through the darkness of the mortal world below. This quiet, midnight vigilance leads us into our 30-second detail, focusing on a deeply misunderstood object resting quietly against the ship's rail. We often associate the iconic round wooden shields of the Norsemen strictly with roaring battles. But on the open ocean, these shields served a far more mundane, comforting purpose. Carved from light, flexible linden wood, and bound in raw leather, rows of these large, beautifully painted discs were often tied along the outer edges of the longship. While they did offer protection from sea spray, their most important function for the sleeping crew was auditory. The overlapping wooden shields created a thick, hollow sound barrier. When the heavy ocean swells crashed against the side of the wooden hull, the shields absorbed the sharp, violent smacks of the water, muffling the chaotic noise of the ocean into a low, deep, rhythmic thumping. In the dead of night, a sailor trying to sleep below the gunwale would press his ear near the wood, listening to this softened, heavy heartbeat of the ship. It was a comforting, acoustic cocoon, a protective wall of wood and leather that kept the terrifying roar of the open sea at bay. When the night watch was finally relieved, the tired men sought a small comfort before crawling into their sleeping bags, bringing us to our 33rd sleepy fact: the soothing, quiet consumption of their daily drink. Fresh water was heavily rationed, and mead was a rare luxury saved only for great feasts on land. For their daily sustenance, the sailors relied on a drink known as sirah, a sour, fermented liquid made from the whey of sheep or cow's milk, left over from the cheese-making process. This tart, milky beverage was incredibly rich in vitamins and naturally resisted spoiling in the damp belly of the ship. They did not drink from delicate cups, but from beautifully hollowed cattle horns, carefully polished until they shone in the dim moonlight. A sailor would unstopper a heavy wooden cask, the scent of sour milk filling the cold air, and pour a small, precious measure into his curved horn. Sitting on a wooden bench, he would sip it slowly, the smooth, cool rim of the horn against his lips, and the tangy, earthy taste of the sirah sliding down his throat offered a slow, grounding moment of nourishment. The hollow horn amplified the sound of his breathing, creating a private, quiet space of comfort in the sprawling darkness. This deep, dark ocean held more than just cold water, leading to our 34th mesmerizing detail about the Voyagers' encounters with the true giants of the deep. There were nights when the heavy fog rolled over the water, so thick that the sailors could not see the bow of their own ship, and the wind died completely away. In this absolute, suffocating silence, they would sometimes hear a sound that vibrated straight through the wooden floorboards and into their very bones. It was a deep, resonating exhale, impossibly loud and impossibly deep, echoing through the mist. The Norsemen knew they were in the presence of Havala, the great whales. A sailor would lean over the wooden rail, his heart beating with a mixture of terror and profound awe, peering into the grey fog. Suddenly, the water just feet from the hull would break, and the massive, sleek black back of a humpback or a blue whale would silently crest the surface, expelling a towering fountain of white mist into the air. The water cascading off the creature's back sounded like a roaring waterfall. The men would stand absolutely still, holding their breath, deeply respectful of this silent, peaceful leviathan that could shatter their wooden ship with a flick of its tail, but instead chose to glide gently past them in the misty darkness, a quiet ghost of the abyss. To survive the freezing temperatures that accompanied that thick ocean fog, we turn to our 35th fact, the incredible weighted comfort of raw animal skins. While their intricately knitted wool kept them warm while working, sleeping exposed on the deck in the northern latitudes required something much heavier. When the deep chill of the night set in, turning the moisture on the deck into a thin, glittering layer of frost, the men unrolled massive, heavy pelts of brown bear or timber wolf. These thick furs were highly prized and deeply cared for. When a freezing sailor finally finished his shift, he would lay his leather sleeping bag down on the wooden planks and pull one of these massive pelts completely over himself. The sheer physical weight of the thick hide acted like a modern weighted blanket, instantly calming his exhausted muscles. The deep, insulating layer of coarse fur trapped his body heat perfectly, while the thick leather backing kept the freezing dew away. Burrowed beneath the heavy, earthy-smelling fur, listening to the rhythmic breathing of his shipmates and the gentle sloshing of the water, a sailor could finally surrender to a deep, warm, impenetrable sleep, held securely in the embrace of the wild creatures of his homeland. Even as most of the crew slept peacefully under those thick furs, there was always quiet work to be done. Bringing us to our 36th detail, the slow, meticulous mending of the massive woolen sails in the moonlight. The relentless ocean wind was brutal on the heavy fabric, often tearing small holes or unraveling the edges during violent gusts. A torn sail was a death sentence on the open sea, so repairs were made constantly, day and night. A designated sailmaker would sit cross-legged on the dark deck, guided only by the pale, silver light of the moon. He would pull a long, smooth needle carved from the shin bone of a pig or a sheep from his leather pouch, threading it with heavy, tar-coated twine. With incredibly slow, deliberate movements, he would push the thick bone needle through the tough, oiled wool, his rough fingers carefully pulling the twine tight to close a tear. It was a rhythmic, meditative task. The soft, tearing sound of the needle piercing the heavy fabric, followed by the slow, sliding hiss of the tarred twine pulling through the hole, was a quiet, constant lullaby for the sleeping men around him. This solitary, peaceful work under the starlight ensured that when the sun rose and the wind gathered again, the great wooden ship would be ready to catch the breath of the world and carry them further into the unknown. When that morning finally arrived, bringing a pale, watery light to the eastern horizon, the navigator would engage in our 37th quiet fact, the incredibly delicate assessment of the invisible air. Before the heavy sails were even touched, he needed to understand the exact mood of the wind. He would not rely on the heavy, flapping canvas, which was too cumbersome to read the subtle morning breezes. Instead, he would step to the very front of the bow, holding a tiny, fraying piece of raw sheep's wool or sometimes a single, soft down feather from a seagull, pinched carefully between his thick thumb and forefinger. Standing absolutely still, he would hold the feather high into the cold, damp air. Every eye on the waking deck would watch that tiny speck of white. If it hung limp, pointing straight down to the dark water, the men knew it would be a day of heavy, rhythmic rowing. But if the feather fluttered and lifted, pointing a steady, invisible path across the water, the captain would nod silently, and the slow, groaning work of raising the massive woolen sail would begin. The space where the men sat to row or rest leads us to our 38th detail: the profound importance of the simple wooden sea chest. Space on a longship was unimaginably tight, and a sailor's chest was his entire private world, ingeniously designed to serve multiple purposes. Carved from sturdy oak or pine, with perfectly fitted iron hinges that had been heavily greased with animal fat to prevent rust, these chests were uniformly sized to sit precisely between the wooden ribs of the hull. They were perfectly flat on top, serving as the very benches upon which the men spent endless hours rowing, eating, and watching the sea. Inside, every item was packed with meticulous, puzzle-like precision. A thick woolen blanket was tightly rolled into a corner. Extra tunics were folded perfectly flat, and small leather pouches containing whetstones, bone needles, and personal amulets were tucked into the remaining crevices. To open a chest during a rough sea was a careful, calculated maneuver to ensure nothing was lost to the water, turning this simple wooden box into an anchor of personal stability in a constantly shifting world. The bodies resting upon those wooden chests bear witness to our 39th quiet truth: the slow, unavoidable weathering of the human form by the relentless ocean. The sea did not just wear away at wood and iron. It profoundly changed the men who sailed it. Over weeks of exposure to the biting salt spray and the constant, harsh wind, a sailor's skin would transform, taking on a deep, leathery texture, heavily lined around the eyes, from constantly squinting against the glare of the sun on the water. Their hands, constantly gripping rough ash oars, pulling heavy, fat-soaked walrus hide ropes, and mending coarse wool, would develop calluses so thick they felt like a second layer of hardened leather. The salt from the ocean mist would deeply embed itself in their long hair and thick beards, acting as a natural stiffening agent that kept the hair firmly in place against the gales. They carried the ocean on their very skin, their bodies slowly adapting and hardening, becoming as tough, resilient, and deeply textured as the wooden ships they commanded. While they were hardened to the elements, they were never entirely alone, bringing us to our 40th detail regarding the silent, beautiful methods of communication between distant ships. Viking voyages were rarely undertaken by a single, solitary vessel. They often traveled in small, loosely scattered fleets. On the vast, rolling ocean, shouting over the roar of the wind and waves was entirely impossible. To speak across the miles of open water, they relied on visual poetry. If a ship needed to signal a change in direction or warn of dangerous shoals ahead, a sailor would climb the wooden rigging and hoist a beautifully woven, brilliantly colored banner, often a bright, stark red or a deep, contrasting white, high up on the mast. In the bright sunlight, they would sometimes take one of their large, polished wooden shields and angle it precisely toward the distant ship, catching the brilliant glare of the sun and flashing a blinding, rhythmic beacon across the waves. It was a silent, flashing language of light and color, allowing the captains to orchestrate their movements and maintain their quiet brotherhood across the great, empty expanses of the sea. As these scattered ships drifted further from their homelands, their survival depended on our 41st sleepy fact, the meticulous, patient reading of the floating debris. The open ocean is not a barren wasteland. It is a slow, flowing river of hidden information. The Norse navigators spent hours leaning quietly against the rail, staring into the rolling blue-green depths, searching for the smallest signs of unseen lands. A tangled patch of brownish-green bladderwrack seaweed drifting past the hull was carefully noted, its condition telling them how far it had traveled from a rocky shore. The most precious sight, however, was a piece of driftwood. If a jagged, broken branch floated by, the captain would study the wood grain and the bark. If it was a type of pine or birch they did not recognize, or if it carried the small, distinct markings of unfamiliar insects, a profound silence would fall over the deck. It was the ocean whispering secrets, a slow, floating promise that land, new, uncharted, and entirely unknown, lay somewhere just over the curved horizon. When that distant land finally materialized from the sea mist, taking the form of towering, jagged coastal cliffs, we discover our 42nd detail, the incredibly tense, silent navigation of the deep fjords. As a longship left the open ocean and entered the narrow, winding waterways, carved between massive stone mountains, the roar of the wind would suddenly vanish, replaced by a heavy, echoing stillness. The deep waters of the fjords hid treacherous, submerged rocks that could easily tear the bottom out of a wooden ship. To navigate this dangerous, shadowy labyrinth, the crew would pull the heavy oars in complete, absolute silence. The captain would stand at the bow, closing his eyes and listening intently. He was listening for the subtle, changing echo of the water, gently lapping against the stone walls. The sound would shift and deepen as the cliff faces narrowed, and it would grow hollow when they passed over an underwater shelf. By reading the acoustic map of the unseen world below, they guided their massive wooden vessel through the jagged stone maze with the quiet, stealthy grace of a hunting wolf. Once they had safely navigated the shadowy, echoing depths of the fjords, they would finally reach our 43rd sleepy fact, the incredibly deliberate and gentle process of bringing the great ship to rest. They did not drop massive, clanking iron anchors that would shatter the quiet peace of the hidden cove. Instead, they relied on a remarkably simple, naturally crafted tool known as a killick. This was a heavy, smooth river boulder that had been carefully encased in a tightly woven cage of strong, flexible hazel or willow branches. When the perfect, sandy bottom was found, a sailor would gently lower the stone killick over the side by a thick leather rope. There was no loud splash, only a soft, heavy parting of the dark water. The crew would listen as the rope slowly fed through their rough hands until the heavy stone finally settled into the soft sand far below. The longship would drift for a few moments, the wooden hull slowly rotating until the leather rope pulled taut, snapping with a soft, satisfying groan as the ship was finally, securely tethered to the earth once more. With the ship safely anchored, the crew engaged in our 44th detail, the miraculous transformation of the open, freezing deck into a cozy, floating longhouse. When resting in a harbour for several days, the men did not continue to sleep exposed to the open sky. Using a complex system of carved wooden poles, they would construct a sturdy frame directly over the center of the deck. Over this wooden skeleton, they carefully draped a massive, specially woven woolen tent, often coated in a light layer of animal fat to repel the rain. This tent was a masterpiece of temporary architecture, stretching perfectly from the wooden rails to the central ridgepole. Once secured, the interior of the ship instantly changed. The harsh, biting wind was shut out, replaced by a warm, heavily insulated acoustic space. The men would unpack their heavy sea chests, lay their fur pelts across the wooden floorboards, and light a small, controlled ember fire in their sand-lined cauldron. The soft orange glow of the firelight, reflecting off the coarse wool above, created an intimate, incredibly comforting haven, a tiny pocket of warmth and shared brotherhood, suspended over the freezing water. When the men finally stepped off the ship and onto the foreign shores, we arrive at our 45th quiet fact, the deeply respectful and almost entirely silent process of trade. The Norse merchants did not conduct their business with loud shouting or aggressive haggling in busy market squares. Trade was a slow, deliberate ritual built on careful observation. A Viking merchant would lay a heavy, dyed woolen blanket out on the wet grass, carefully placing his goods upon it, a beautiful stack of thick winter fox furs, a carved walrus ivory comb, or a heavy block of golden amber. The local traders would approach quietly, laying their own offerings of fine silver coins, woven silks, or high-quality iron ingots on the opposite edge of the blanket. Without speaking a word, they would slowly adjust the piles, adding a silver coin here, pulling back a fur there, reading each other's eyes and micro-expressions. When an agreement was finally reached, they would seal the pact not with a shout, but with a firm, mutual clasp of the forearms, a quiet acknowledgement of fairness that crossed the immense barriers of unknown languages. The currency used in these silent exchanges brings us to our 46th fascinating detail, the delicate and precise weighing of hack silver. The Norsemen did not rely on the stamped value of foreign coins. They cared only for the pure, undeniable weight of the precious metal. Every merchant carried a tiny, beautifully crafted set of folding bronze scales, often kept in a small, decorated leather pouch, hanging from his belt. When a trade involved silver, the coins, bracelets, or silver bars were simply placed on a small wooden block and struck with a heavy iron chisel, chopping the metal into rough, jagged pieces. The merchant would unfold his delicate bronze scales, hanging the two tiny pans from a central pivot by incredibly fine threads. Using a set of intricately cast lead weights, often shaped like tiny birds or complex geometric patterns, he would meticulously weigh out the exact amount of chopped silver needed for the trade. The tiny, high-pitched clinking of the silver fragments dropping into the bronze pan was a sound of absolute precision, a delicate, metallic song that represented the quiet, calculating heart of the Viking trading empire. Before returning to their ship, the crew would participate in our 47th fact, the vital, foraging walks along the unfamiliar coastlines. A long ocean voyage severely depleted their bodies of necessary nutrients, and the men understood the healing power of the natural flora. Moving quietly in small groups along the frosty, rocky beaches, they would search for small, resilient green plants clinging to the harsh landscape. They specifically sought out scurvy grass, a thick, fleshy-leaved plant packed with vitamin C, and wild angelica, which grew tall along the damp riverbanks. They would gently pluck the green leaves and dig up the thick, aromatic roots, filling small woven baskets with their harvest. As they walked, the heavy leather of their turn shoes crunched softly on the frost-covered pebbles, and the sharp, clean scent of the crushed coastal herbs mingled with the pervasive smell of the ocean air. They would eat the bitter, peppery greens completely raw as they walked, feeling the vital, earthy energy of the fresh plants, slowly returning strength to their exhausted, sea-weary bones. As they prepared the ship for the long journey back into the open ocean, we discover our 48th detail, the meticulous, fragrant process of packing the cargo hold. The belly of the longship had to be perfectly balanced, and the precious new cargo needed absolute protection from the ever-present seawater sloshing in the bilge. To achieve this, the crew gathered massive piles of fresh, flexible pine and spruce branches from the nearby forests. They carefully layered these springy green branches along the very bottom of the wooden hull, creating a thick, fragrant cushion known as dunnage. When the heavy wooden chests of silver silk and forged iron were lowered into the hull, they rested safely on top of this green bed, keeping them elevated securely above the damp floorboards. As the crew worked, carefully wedging the chests together so they would not shift in a storm, the intense, sweet aroma of the crushed pine needles filled the entire ship. It was a beautiful, practical use of the forest, infusing the dark, salty belly of the wood and iron vessel with the comforting, deeply familiar scent of the deep woods they were so eager to return to. With the cargo perfectly secured and the scent of the forest lingering in the air, the time would finally come to leave the quiet sanctuary of the cove, bringing us to our 49th fact, the incredibly gentle method of pushing the heavy ship back into the sea. The Norsemen did not rely on frantic, splashing rowing to pull the fully loaded gnar off the soft beach, knowing such force could easily scrape the protective layer of pine tar from the wooden hull. Instead, they utilized long, smooth poles made of sturdy, unyielding ash wood known as stakkar. Standing evenly spaced along the outer edges of the deck, The men would lower these blunt poles directly into the shallow, crystalline water until they met the soft sand below. Working in perfect, unspoken unison, they would lean their shoulders heavily against the smooth wood. With a slow, deep, resonant groan from the wooden hull, the massive ship would gently slide backward, slipping smoothly off the beach and floating effortlessly into the deeper water. The only sounds were the soft, wet sliding of wood against wet sand, the quiet, synchronized breathing of the men, and the gentle lapping of small waves against the bow, a peaceful departure that left the untouched cove exactly as quiet as they had found it. Once the ship was floating freely on the tide, the crew prepared for the open water, leading to our 50th detail concerning the specific acoustic ritual of securing the long oars. Before a single stroke was pulled, the rowers had to carefully lock their oars into the carved wooden oarlocks along the rail. These were not simple iron pins, but beautifully shaped pieces of birch or oak, often lovingly carved to resemble the curved, sweeping heads of seabirds, known as kapar. A sailor would slide his long, heavy ash oar into the curved resting place, and then secure it tightly with a small, supple loop of braided walrus hide to prevent it from slipping. The process of 30 men simultaneously locking their heavy oars into place created a distinct, echoing wooden click that resonated down the entire length of the ship. It was a deeply satisfying, mechanical sound, a quiet, rhythmic confirmation that the wooden beast was fully armed and ready to begin its slow, steady crawl across the ocean's surface. As they pulled away from the land and the rhythmic splashing of the oars took hold, the navigator watched the water change, bringing us to our 51st sleepy fact about their remarkable ability to read the ocean's depth entirely by its color. As they moved from the shallow coastal shelves toward the deep, hidden trenches, the navigator did not need a sounding line or a weighted rope. He simply leaned over the steering board and watched the hues of the water slowly shift beneath them. In the shallows, the water held a cloudy, pale green tint reflecting the white sand and coastal algae swaying below. As the sandy bottom dropped away, the water deepened into a rich, heavy emerald green, signaling the steep edge of the continental shelf. Finally, when the ship crossed out into the true, fathomless deep of the open ocean, the water would suddenly turn a profound, absorbing shade of dark, ink-like indigo. Watching this slow, beautiful transition of colors was a quiet meditation for the helmsman, a visual map painted entirely by the immense depth of the world beneath their wooden planks. The man responsible for reading those deeply colored waters brings us to our 52nd detail, the unique and deeply respected position of the helmsman at the rear of the ship. The steering of a Viking longship was not done with a modern central wheel, but with a massive, specially carved oar attached to the right side of the stern, which gives us the ancient root for the word starboard, the steering board. The helmsman stood upon a small, slightly elevated wooden platform, or sometimes sat upon a specially carved wooden block, separating him slightly from the rowing crew. He held a smooth, horizontal wooden tiller arm that was directly connected to the massive steering blade in the water. This position required immense physical endurance and a deeply calm, focused mind. For hours on end, he would stand almost perfectly still, feeling the tremendous, vibrating pressure of the ocean currents pushing against the wooden blade, transferring the raw, flowing energy of the sea directly into his thick, calloused hands. The creation of that massive steering blade is our 53rd quiet fact, revealing it as one of the most critical and carefully crafted pieces of wood on the entire vessel. The steery, as it was called, could not be made from just any straight piece of timber. Master shipbuilders would slowly search the silent forests for a massive oak tree that possessed a very specific, natural curve at its base, right where the thick trunk met the heaviest root in the earth. This natural, sweeping shape provided incredible, unbreakable strength that could never be achieved by joining two separate pieces of wood. The blade was carved to be wide and flat, shaped almost like the sleek wing of a diving bird, designed to slice smoothly through the heavy water with minimal resistance while offering maximum control. It was attached to the side of the hull using a remarkably flexible, thick rope of braided pine roots or twisted walrus hide, allowing the heavy oak blade to pivot seamlessly with the rolling waves. The quiet, masterful carving of this single piece of oak was the sole reason the great ship could navigate the unpredictable, shifting moods of the open sea. Yet, even with perfect steering and a masterfully crafted blade, the open ocean often brought blinding conditions, leading to our 54th detail, the haunting, mournful sounds used to navigate the thickest coastal fogs when the sea mist grew so dense that the navigator could not see the carved dragon head on the bow of his own ship, and multiple vessels were traveling together in a loose fleet. The risk of a silent, catastrophic wooden collision was a profound concern. To quietly communicate their positions in the suffocating, wet, grey blindness, the crew used simple, hollowed-out animal horns, often from a large goat or a Highland cow. A sailor standing near the misty bow would press his cold lips to the narrow end and blow a long, slow, incredibly deep breath. The horn produced a low, resonant, vibrating blast that rolled heavily over the calm, obscured water. A few moments later, a faint, muted, answering blast would echo back from a hidden ship somewhere in the white void. These slow, echoing calls and responses sounded like the cries of lonely, mythical sea beasts, providing a hauntingly beautiful, auditory lifeline that kept the hidden fleet safely apart as they drifted blindly through the quiet fog. When the thick, haunting fog finally began to dissipate, tearing into long, wispy grey ribbons that vanished against the ocean breeze, the sky often opened up to reveal a steady, soaking rain. This brings us to our 55th quiet fact, the meticulous and grateful collection of the falling fresh water. The Norsemen did not view a steady rainstorm as a misery, but as a generous gift from the heavy clouds above. As the large, cool drops began to drum a rhythmic, soothing beat against the wooden deck and the stretched woolen sails, the crew sprang into a quiet, organized dance. They quickly unrolled wide sheets of tightly woven linen or specially prepared, thinly scraped animal hides, stretching them securely between the rigging lines. These makeshift rain catchers were angled precisely, so that the pure, cold rainwater would pool and channel into a heavy, steady stream flowing directly into their open wooden casks. The sweet, clean sound of the fresh rainwater splashing into the hollow barrels was a joyous music to the thirsty sailors, turning the grey, wet day into a peaceful harvest that sustained them for weeks to come. As the day gave way to night, and the rain passed, leaving a perfectly clear, starless sky, the ocean itself sometimes provided the light, leading us to our 56th mesmerizing debate about the silent magic of the glowing water. In certain stretches of the North Atlantic, particularly during the warmer, darker months, the ship would sail through massive, unseen blooms of bioluminescent plankton. As the heavy wooden hull sliced through the pitch-black ocean, the disturbed water would suddenly ignite with an ethereal, glowing, neon blue and pale green light. Every dip of the long ash oars created swirling underwater galaxies that spun and faded in the dark depths. The sailors would lean silently over the wooden rail, their faces illuminated by the ghostly, cold light radiating from the sea, watching the glowing, swirling wake trailing far behind the ship. It was a profoundly silent, magical experience, making the men feel as if they were slowly sailing across a sky filled with liquid, glowing stars, floating suspended in an endless, magical void. Sleeping through these wet, magical nights introduces our 57th sleepy fact, the incredible waterproofing of their personal sanctuaries. To survive a sudden nighttime downpour while sleeping entirely exposed on the open deck, the men relied deeply on the heavy, oiled leather of their hudfat, the large sleeping bags they shared. These bags were not merely sewn hides. They were meticulously prepared shields against the elements. During the day, the sailors would sit on their sea chests and heavily massage rich, pungent seal oil or rendered fish fat deeply into the exterior of the cowhide. By the time night fell, the leather was completely saturated. When the rain came, it did not soak into the leather, but rather beaded up instantly, rolling off the curved surface of the sleeping bags in tiny, glistening drops. Safe inside, 2 or 3 men would listen to the rapid, drumming sound of the heavy rain, striking the stiff leather inches from their faces, remaining completely warm and dry in their dark, cozy cocoon while the storm washed the wooden deck clean around them. Keeping perfectly dry leads us to our 58th detail, the incredibly protective, intimate way the Norsemen guarded their ability to create fire. In an environment defined by endless ocean spray and soaking rain, dry tinder was more precious than gold. The designated fire watcher did not keep his flint, steel, and tinder in a simple pouch where the damp air could ruin it. Instead, he carried his spark-catching materials in a small, waterproof tube intricately carved from a piece of hollowed bone or a polished, watertight brass cylinder. Inside this tiny vault rested pieces of a specific fungus called amadou, carefully harvested from birch trees and boiled in wood ash until it was as soft and flammable as cotton. To ensure it remained absolutely bone-dry, the fire watcher often wore this sealed cylinder on a leather thong directly against his bare chest, beneath his layers of thick wool. His own radiating body heat acted as a constant, gentle oven, ensuring that when a fire was desperately needed, the tinder within the bone tube was perfectly dry and ready to catch the very first tiny spark. When the fire was safely lit and the long, calm days stretched endlessly toward the horizon, the men returned to their quiet crafts, bringing us to our 59th fact: the meticulous, delicate art of bone carving. The ocean often offered up treasures in the form of smooth, bleached bones from whales, or the discarded, ivory-like tusks of walruses found washed upon distant shores. In the bright, slow afternoons, a sailor would sit cross-legged near the bow, holding a small piece of this dense, white material. Using tiny, razor-sharp iron tools, he would spend countless hours carefully scratching and carving microscopic details into the bone. The work required an incredibly steady hand and a deeply focused mind, oblivious to the rocking of the ship. They carved beautiful, ornate hairpins for their wives, smooth gaming pieces for the long winter nights back home, and tiny, stylized animal figures. The rhythmic, delicate scratching of the iron tip against the hard bone was a tiny, localized sound of creation, a peaceful meditation that resulted in beautiful, enduring pieces of art born from the quietest hours of the voyage. Observing these master carvers and veteran navigators brings us to our 60th detail: the quiet, wide-eyed presence of the ship's boys. A Viking crew was not solely made of hardened, bearded warriors. It almost always included young boys, often no older than 12 or 13, experiencing their very first taste of the open sea. These boys were not given heavy oars or expected to fight storms. They were there to silently absorb the immense knowledge of the older men. They moved quietly around the deck, like small shadows, fetching water, carrying tools for the ship's carpenter, and learning the complex, vibrating language of the ropes. A boy would sit perfectly still beside the navigator for hours, simply watching how the older man read the color of the water, or felt the wind on his face. Their small, rough hands learned to tie the intricate knots, and their ears slowly became attuned to the groans and creaks of the wooden hull. It was a silent, profound apprenticeship, a peaceful passing of ancient, vital knowledge from one generation to the next, ensuring that the quiet mastery of the ocean would never be forgotten. The knowledge these young boys absorbed was not limited to the wind and the waves. They also learned the quiet mathematics of survival, bringing us to our 61st detail regarding the simple, wooden records of their journey. There were no parchment logs or ink pens on the damp deck of a longship. To track their precious supplies, the crew relied on a deeply tactile system of wooden tally sticks. A quartermaster would take a smooth, squared piece of hazelwood and a sharp iron knife. For every cask of dried fish consumed or barrel of fresh water emptied, he would press the blade into the wood, carving a small, clean notch across the edge. If a trade was made, he would split the notched stick perfectly down the middle, giving one half to the merchant and keeping the other. In the quiet hours of the afternoon, the boy might watch the quartermaster slowly run his calloused thumb over the jagged row of notches, reading the carved wood like a blind man, reading a story, a silent, indisputable record of what they had lost and what they had gained, permanently etched into the grain. This careful counting of supplies became incredibly tense. During our 60-second quiet fact, the profound, suffocating stillness of a dead calm. There were days when the wind simply vanished, leaving the ocean as flat and featureless as a heavy sheet of forged iron. Rowing was exhausting and slowly drained their water supplies, so the men often had to wait. During these long, sweltering days, the navigator became a reader of the high sky. He would lie flat on his back upon his wooden chest, staring up at the blinding white canopy, searching for the thinnest, highest cirrus clouds, known to them as mare's tails. He watched how these feathery wisps of ice crystals slowly drifted across the blue expanse, knowing that the high, unseen winds would eventually pull the heavier, lower air along with them. It was a game of immense patience, reading the subtle, slow-moving signs painted miles above their heads, waiting for the heavy sails to finally ripple and sigh with the returning breath of the world. While the navigator watched the clouds, the resting crew engaged in our 63rd detail, the deeply strategic and entirely silent playing of their ancient board games to keep their minds sharp and pass the endless hours of calm. 2 sailors would unfold a piece of heavy leather, or a flat wooden board meticulously carved with a grid of intersecting lines. This was the game of Hnefatafl, the king's table. They did not use simple wooden discs, but beautifully carved pieces of dark whalebone and bright, polished amber contrasting sharply against the wooden grid. The game represented a king defending his stronghold against overwhelming attackers. The 2 men would sit cross-legged, entirely motionless for long stretches of time, their eyes locked on the carved pieces. The only sound was the satisfying, hollow click of a bone piece being moved to a new square, and the quiet, heavy breathing of the players. It was a silent battlefield of the mind, a strategic meditation that required deep focus and provided a quiet escape from the vast emptiness surrounding them. When the wind finally returned and carried them past lonely, towering sea stacks, rising sharply from the ocean, they took advantage of our 64th sleepy fact, the perilous, quiet harvest of the cliffs. These sheer rock faces were home to thousands of nesting seabirds, like puffins, guillemots, and razorbills, navigating the longship as close as they dared to the jagged rocks. A nimble sailor, often the youngest and lightest, would be secured to a thick walrus hide rope. With the rope anchored by 3 strong men on the deck, he would slowly, carefully step off the wooden rail onto the slippery, guano-covered stone. Moving with incredible grace and completely devoid of fear, he would scale the sheer cliff face, reaching deep into the narrow rock crevices. He would gently pull out the large, speckled eggs, placing them carefully into a soft leather pouch slung across his chest. The crew on the ship watched in absolute silence, holding their breath until the climber was safely pulled back onto the deck, bringing with him a rare, precious feast of rich, fresh yolks that tasted wildly of the salty sea and the high winds. The presence of those rocky shoals often prompted our 65th detail, the slow, methodical grooming of the longship's underbelly. Over months at sea, the submerged oak planks would gather a thick, dragging beard of green sea moss, tiny sharp barnacles, and slimy algae. This growth created friction, slowly stealing the ship's speed. When they found a quiet, sandy inlet with a significant tidal drop, they would carefully run the ship aground at high tide. As the water slowly receded, leaving the massive wooden hull exposed on the wet sand, the men went to work. Using thick bundles of stiff heather or coarse, tightly bound birch twigs, they would aggressively scrub the wet wood. It was an exhausting, rhythmic chore. The sound of the stiff twigs scraping against the salt-encrusted oak filled the quiet cove. They scraped away the clinging sea life, revealing the smooth, tar-coated wood beneath, a rejuvenating massage for the tired vessel that would allow her to slice cleanly through the deep waters once again. When the tide returned to lift her away, when they returned to the open ocean, refreshed and clean, the final approach to a new shore was often heralded by our 66th quiet fact: the sudden, overwhelming change in the scent of the air. Long before the highest mountain peaks appeared on the horizon, the men could smell the earth. After weeks of inhaling nothing but the sharp, sterile scent of ozone, biting salt, and damp wool, the first waft of land was intoxicating. A sailor would suddenly stop his work, lift his chin, and flare his nostrils, closing his eyes to savor the invisible message on the wind. The breeze carried the rich, heavy perfume of sun-baked pine needles, the deep, damp smell of rotting leaves in a dark forest, and the sweet, almost floral scent of fresh river water mixing with the sea. This fragrant promise of land washed over the deck, a silent, aromatic assurance that their long, perilous journey across the vast blue emptiness was finally coming to a safe and welcomed end. As that fragrant promise of land washed over the deck, the men prepared for one of their most unique advantages, bringing us to our 67th quiet fact: the incredible design that allowed them to bypass deep-water docks entirely. A massive, fully loaded Viking longship drew remarkably little water, often requiring less than 3 feet of depth to float. They did not need to search for deep, natural harbors or construct massive stone piers. The navigator could steer the great wooden vessel straight out of the ocean and glide silently up a shallow, winding river, or directly onto a gently sloping, sandy beach. The crew would stand perfectly still, listening closely as the deep water gave way to the shallows, waiting for the soft, satisfying thud and the slow, grinding sound of the thick oak keel, finally settling securely into the soft earth, bringing their long, precarious journey to a gentle, motionless stop. With the ship resting firmly on the sand, the crew engaged in our 68th detail, the slow, complex process of dismantling the ship's great wooden spine. The massive pine mast that had carried them across the sea was not permanently fixed to the hull. It rested inside a massive, incredibly heavy block of shaped oak called the Curling, or the Old Woman, located in the absolute center of the bilge. Before leaving the ship, the men would carefully pull the heavy wooden wedges that held the mast tight. using a complex groaning system of thick walrus hide ropes and sheer, synchronized physical strength. They would slowly, carefully lower the towering pine pole. They did not lay it on the deck, but rested it horizontally along specially carved, raised wooden supports called mast crutches. Laying the mast down instantly transformed the silhouette of the ship, signifying a profound, quiet transition from a dynamic vessel of the sea to a resting, dormant creature of the land. Moving their supplies to the shore introduces our 69th quiet fact: the immediate and beautiful construction of their land shelters. The men did not sleep on the damp earth. They carried specially crafted wooden tent frames, designed in a stipe frame shape to shed the heavy coastal rains. These tents, known as chald, were masterpieces of portable architecture. The ends of the wooden ridge poles were not left plain. They were intricately carved with the serene, sweeping faces of stylized mythical beasts, offering a silent, watchful protection over the sleeping men. Over these sturdy frames, they draped massive, thick sheets of tightly woven wool or heavy sailcloth, pegging them firmly into the soil. The interior of the chald was instantly warm and deeply insulated, filled with the soft, earthy scent of crushed grass and dry wool, providing a familiar, comforting sanctuary upon an unfamiliar, distant shore. The 70th fact involves the deeply satisfying, almost euphoric transition of their diet after weeks on the open water. With a proper, roaring fire finally built upon a safe, stable hearth of rounded river stones on the beach, the men unpacked their most prized cooking vessels. These were incredibly heavy, thick-walled grey cauldrons carved entirely from solid pieces of Norwegian soapstone. This remarkable stone absorbed heat slowly and retained it for hours. The cooks would fill the cauldrons with fresh water from a nearby stream, adding chunks of fresh, hunted meat, wild coastal onions, and foraged, earthy root vegetables. As the fire roared, the soapstone would slowly bring the water to a gentle, bubbling simmer. The rich, thick aroma of a hot, savory stew slowly filled the beach camp. Eating this hot, nourishing meal from small, hand-carved wooden bowls was a quiet, celebratory moment, a profound comfort that finally replaced the endless, monotonous chewing of cold, dry, salted stockfish. As they stood around that roaring fire, holding their warm wooden bowls, the men experienced our 71st curious detail: the strange, disorienting sensation of land sickness. After weeks of their internal balance adjusting perfectly to the constant, violent rolling of the ocean swells, their bodies stubbornly continued to compensate on solid ground. For the first few days ashore, even the most seasoned, hardened sailors would walk with a wide, slightly unsteady gait. When they stood perfectly still on the unmoving beach, they would feel a phantom swaying deep within their bones, as though the motionless earth beneath their leather turnshoes was slowly pitching and rolling like the wooden deck. It was a dizzying, quiet reminder that the sea had deeply ingrained itself into their very physiology, claiming them as creatures of the water long after they had stepped onto the dirt. To steady themselves and clear the lingering salt from their mouths, they sought out our 72nd necessity, the pure, rushing water of the deep coastal streams. They eagerly left their stale wooden casks behind and walked slowly upstream, moving through the quiet, damp forests to where the water flowed rapidly over smooth, mossy stones, often fed directly by melting mountain glaciers high above. Kneeling quietly on the damp riverbank, a sailor would cup his heavily calloused hands and submerge them in the freezing, crystal-clear stream. He would drink deeply, savoring the crisp, sharp, mineral taste of the earth. The glacier water was shockingly cold, completely lacking the stagnant, pine tar and oak-flavored staleness of their ship's barrels. This quiet, simple act of drinking fresh, running water was a deeply grounding ritual, washing away the exhaustion of the sea and reconnecting their weary spirits to the vibrant, living land. This profound connection to the land extended to the people who might already inhabit it, revealing our 73rd fact: the quiet, highly respectful exchanges with local coastal tribes. If the Norsemen arrived on a settled shore, they did not immediately disembark with drawn, clashing swords and loud battle cries. A solitary captain, often chosen for his calm demeanor, would walk slowly up the sandy beach with open, empty hands to show he carried no weapons. He would bring a simple, highly valuable token of goodwill, perhaps a finely forged iron axe head, a beautiful silver ring, or a perfectly polished piece of walrus ivory. He would walk to a neutral point on the shore, lay the precious item softly on a prominent rock and step backward in complete silence. He would wait patiently for the locals to emerge from the tree line and offer a trade of their own, establishing a fragile, unspoken peace through the universal, quiet language of mutual respect and generosity. If this new, peaceful land was chosen as their home for the upcoming winter, the crew faced our 74th monumental task: the painstaking extraction of their ships from the freezing water. Leaving a wooden ship in the ocean over the winter was a death sentence, as expanding sea ice would easily crush the clinker-built hull. The men would venture into the forest, cutting down dozens of straight, smooth pine trees and stripping them of their bark. They laid these logs horizontally across the beach, creating a makeshift wooden track leading away from the tide. Working together in perfect, synchronized rhythm, pushing with all of their combined physical might, they would slowly roll the massive, heavy wooden ships completely out of the ocean. The oak keel would groan heavily as it slid over the pine rollers, inching its way high up onto the dry land, safely elevating the delicate wooden vessel far above the destructive reach of the freezing winter tide. Protecting these vital, resting vessels leads us to our 75th detail: the incredible construction of massive earthen boathouses, known as masts. They did not simply leave the ships exposed to the harsh winter blizzards. The men would dig long, shallow trenches in the soft soil, exactly the length of the ship, and build low, sturdy walls out of stacked field stones. Over the top of these walls, they laid a thick, sloping wooden roof. Finally, they cut heavy, damp squares of living, root-filled turf from the surrounding meadows and stacked tightly over the entire wooden structure. The grass within the turf would continue to grow, completely camouflaging the massive boathouse into the rolling green hills of the landscape. Inside this dark, earthy cavern, the wooden ship remained perfectly insulated and dry throughout the darkest, coldest months, waiting silently in its grassy tomb for the eventual return of the spring thaw. While the ship rested quietly under the earth, the men turned to our 76th quiet fact, the rhythmic, ringing work of the winter blacksmith. Every crew carried a master of the forge, and they unpacked small, incredibly heavy, portable iron anvils and beautifully stitched leather bellows. Under the roof of a turf house, surrounded by the deep, silent snows of winter, the smith would build a scorching charcoal fire. He would place broken iron rivets, snapped tools, and bent blades into the glowing coals until they reached a brilliant, translucent cherry red. The sharp, high-pitched, musical ringing of his heavy hammer, striking and reshaping the soft metal, was a comforting, industrious sound that echoed softly across the quiet, snow-covered valley. This slow, meticulous repair work ensured that when the ice finally broke, their tools and weapons would be perfectly restored, reborn from the fire, and ready for the challenges of a new year. As the men forged the heavy iron, the women and the older, weathered sailors partook in our 77th detail, the endless, hypnotic, and deeply calming spinning of new threads. The heavy woolen sails and the countless yards of warm clothing required constant replacement. Sitting by the warm, glowing hearth fire during the long, dark winter nights, they utilized simple, hand-carved wooden drop spindles. A spinner would hold a mass of raw, combed sheep's wool, called a distaff, beneath their arm. With a gentle flick of their fingers, they would set the wooden spindle, twirling gracefully toward the floor, slowly drafting and pulling the soft fibers as the spinning weight twisted them tightly into a strong, unified yarn. The wooden spindle would twirl and hum with a low, soft vibration, a quiet, endlessly repetitive motion that literally wove the very fabric of their future voyages, binding their hopes of returning to the sea with the warm, fire-lit comfort of the winter lodge. This patient winter work was often illuminated by our 78th breathtaking fact, the silent, celestial fire of the northern lights. During the deepest, darkest months of the year, when the sun barely crested the horizon, the sky would often turn a deep, freezing, flawless black. Without warning, massive, glowing ribbons of ethereal green and pale violet light would begin to slowly dance, ripple, and weave across the tapestry of stars. The men and women would step outside their low, grass-roofed turf houses, their breath plumbing in thick white clouds in the freezing air. They would stand in absolute, profound silence, staring up in awe at what they believed to be the glowing, shifting armor of the legendary Valkyries or the shimmering bridge to the realm of the gods. The aurora borealis made no sound, but its slow, mesmerizing movement across the dark heavens provided a magical, deeply comforting reassurance, a quiet reminder that even in the absolute depths of the darkest winter, the world was still filled with profound, radiant beauty. When that radiant beauty of the winter sky finally began to soften, and the long, dark grip of the season slowly loosened, the first sign of spring was not the singing of birds, but our 79th quiet fact, the immense echoing song of the melting ice. As the days stretched longer and the sun warmed the earth, the thick, solid layer of ice covering the quiet fjords began to shift and break. The sound it produced was astonishing, echoing through the steep stone valleys like deep, distant thunder or the low, resonant groans of waking giants. A sailor would stand quietly near the shoreline, listening to the ice popping and fracturing, watching massive, jagged white plates slowly separate and drift out toward the open sea. It was a powerful acoustic awakening, a natural clock signaling to the resting voyagers that the frozen world was finally unlocking its doors, inviting them back onto the restless, flowing waters. Before the ship could touch that newly freed water, the crew engaged in our 80th meticulous detail, the warm, deeply fragrant process of retarring the wooden hull. After months, resting in the dry earthen nast, the oak planks were desperate for protection. The men built a slow, gentle fire on the beach and placed heavy iron cauldrons over the coals, filling them with thick, black chunks of raw pine tar. As the tar slowly melted into a rich, bubbling liquid, the entire camp was enveloped in an incredibly dense, sweet, and smoky aroma that smelled of ancient, burning forests. Using large, heavy brushes made from tightly bound horsehair, the sailors worked in slow, rhythmic strokes, painting the hot, liquid tar over every inch of the overlapping oak. The dry wood eagerly drank the hot resin, turning from a pale, weathered grey to a deep, lustrous, dark brown, sealing the vessel perfectly against the biting salt of the sea once more. While the ship slowly dried in the bright spring sun, a small group of men took to the high ground for our 81st sleepy fact, the silent construction of enduring stone guides. To ensure they, or any future voyagers, could safely find this specific hidden cove again, they built a massive cairn, known as a vard. They did not simply throw rocks into a pile. They meticulously selected flat, heavy field stones, stacking them with incredible balance and precision on the very highest, most visible cliff edge overlooking the ocean. They worked quietly, passing the heavy stones hand to hand, building a tall, distinct silhouette against the sky. This silent monument contained no written words, but it spoke a clear, vital language to any navigator on the water. A permanent, quiet lighthouse of stone that promised a safe harbor and calm waters, hidden just behind the jagged rocks. As they gathered the final supplies for the voyage, they sought out our 82nd detail, the incredibly delicate harvest of the coastal eiderdown. The men walked softly along the rocky shores and hidden marshes, carefully searching for the abandoned nests of the eider ducks. These birds plucked the incredibly soft, light down from their own breasts to line their nests and protect their eggs from the freezing wind. Once the ducklings had hatched and left for the sea, the Norsemen gently gathered this discarded treasure. It was a slow, meticulous harvest, picking tiny grey feathers from the dry grass and moss. A massive sack of eiderdown weighed almost nothing. Yet, when packed tightly into a woven linen casing, it provided an unimaginable level of warmth for a hardened sailor used to sleeping under heavy, coarse bearskins. a small pillow, or a lined cloak made from this weightless, floating down, was a rare, profound comfort against the chilling winds of the open ocean. When the ship was finally loaded, and the heavy pine mast raised back into the sky, we discover our 83rd quiet fact, the deeply respectful, completely unblemished departure from the winter camp. As the longship gently slipped away from the sand, carried by the receding tide, the men did not leave behind a scarred, ruined landscape. The earthen mast that had sheltered their ship simply looked like a grassy, elongated mound that belonged perfectly to the rolling hills. The fire pits were carefully smothered with cold sand, and any leftover scraps of wood were scattered back into the forest. Looking back from the wooden deck, a sailor would see nothing but a pristine, quiet cove, looking exactly as untouched and wild as the day they had first arrived. It was a silent testament to their deep integration with the natural world, moving through the harsh landscape like passing shadows, leaving only their stone vard, watching silently from the cliffs above. Once they were back on the open water, navigating the complex, shallow shoals of the coastline required our 84th detail, the ingenious and tactile use of the sounding lead. To know the exact depth of the water and the nature of the unseen ocean floor beneath them, the navigator used a heavy, bell-shaped piece of forged lead attached to a long, carefully measured hemp line. He would stand at the bow and smoothly swing the heavy lead, tossing it far ahead of the ship. The rope would slip rapidly through his rough fingers until the line suddenly went slack. By feeling the distance marked on the rope, he knew the exact depth. But the true genius lay at the very bottom of the lead bell, which was hollowed out and filled with a thick plug of sticky animal tallow. When he pulled the heavy weight back up from the depths, the sticky fat brought a sample of the ocean floor with it. The navigator would quietly examine the tallow, finding crushed white shells, fine grey sand, or thick black mud, reading the hidden earth beneath the waves like a physical map. As they moved into deeper waters, relying on those tactile maps, the ocean often revealed our 85th mesmerizing fact, the sudden, overwhelming arrival of the silver shoals. There were calm, bright days when the deep indigo water would suddenly shift, transforming into an endless, flashing expanse of brilliant silver. The ship had sailed directly into a massive, migrating school of Atlantic herring, millions of fish, moving in perfect, silent unison just beneath the surface. The water would literally boil with life, creating a soft, hissing sound as thousands of tiny fins broke the surface tension. The men would lean over the rails, staring down into the glowing metallic water. They did not frantically cast nets, for their ship was already full and they had miles to go. Instead, they watched in quiet, profound awe as the endless silver river flowed perfectly around their wooden hull, a breathtaking display of the ocean's immense, unseen bounty. When the warm spring air met the freezing ocean currents, it often summoned a familiar challenge, leading to our 86th quiet fact, the acoustic navigation of the sea fret. When the thick, blinding fog rolled rapidly over the ship, swallowing the horizon and the coastline, the sounding lead was not enough. To avoid crashing into unseen, towering cliffs, the captain would stand at the very front of the ship and forcefully clap his heavy, calloused hands together, or strike two flat pieces of hardwood against each other. He would then stand perfectly still, turning his head and listening intensely to the suffocating, white void. He was waiting for the sharp, delayed echo to bounce back from the hidden stone walls. By counting the slow seconds between the sharp crack of the wood and the soft, returning ghost of the sound, he could perfectly calculate the distance to the unseen danger, guiding the ship blindly but safely through the fog, using nothing but the bouncing waves of sound. As the fog lifted and the deck warmed again, the crew's silent companion emerged, bringing us to our 87th detail, the ship's cat reclaiming its watchful post. The fluffy Norwegian forest cat, having spent the freezing winter curled deeply within a woven basket or tucked into a sailor's heavy fur, would eagerly climb out onto the sun-baked wooden rails. The sailors would watch with quiet amusement as the cat stretched its long, thick-furred back, digging its sharp claws satisfyingly into the tough pine tar of the wood. The cat would then find the highest, warmest coil of thick hemp rope, curling into a tight, vibrating ball of contentment. Its soft, steady purring was a deeply domestic, comforting sound that contrasted beautifully with the harsh expanse of the ocean, a tiny, warm heartbeat that made the massive wooden warship feel briefly and wonderfully like a quiet home. Above the resting cat, the massive woolen sail caught the wind, revealing our 88th detail, the beautiful, faded history written upon the fabric. When they had first left their homeland, the large square sail was brilliantly dyed, perhaps in vibrant stripes of madder red and woad blue. But after a year of relentless exposure to the harsh, bleaching power of the sun, the freezing salt spray, and the violent winds, the colors had profoundly transformed. The bright red had softened into a gentle, dusty rose, and the deep blue had faded to the pale, muted shade of the winter sky. To the crew, this faded sail was not a sign of ruin, but a badge of immense honor. Every faded thread and carefully stitched patch told a quiet story of a storm survived and a horizon crossed. Watching that soft, pastel canvas fill with the wind was a deeply comforting sight, a visible, woven history of their endurance suspended against the clouds. The wind that filled that faded sail brings us to our 89th sleepy fact, the subtle, deeply felt change in the air that signaled the journey home. The navigators did not just read the direction of the wind. They felt its distinct character. For weeks, they had battled the harsh, biting northern gales that smelled of ice and ancient stone. But as they turned their ship southward, waiting patiently for the shift, a new breeze would finally catch the sail. This wind was different. It carried a faint, almost imperceptible warmth, and the air felt slightly softer, heavier with moisture, smelling faintly of the warmer blooming lands far ahead. A sailor standing on the deck would close his eyes, turning his weathered face into this gentle breeze, feeling a profound, quiet relief wash over his tired muscles. It was the breath of the South, a silent, atmospheric promise that they were finally, truly, on their way back to the hearths they had left so long ago. As that warm wind pushed them steadily forward, the men engaged in our 90th quiet fact, the silent, emotional counting of the journey's length. Sitting on their wooden sea chests, lulled by the rhythmic splashing of the water against the hull, a sailor might slowly open his leather pouch and pull out a small bundle of knotted string or a thin carved stick. Throughout the long voyage, he had meticulously tied a tiny knot or carved a tiny notch for every full moon that had passed since they left their families, running his rough thumb slowly over the series of bumps or grooves. He would silently calculate the time. It was a deeply personal, quiet meditation, a physical connection to the passing of time that brought a mixture of heavy longing and quiet joy, knowing that with every gentle push of the southern wind, they were drawing one day closer to the end of their epic, floating isolation. As that isolation slowly began to fracture, the visual landscape of their world began to shift, bringing us to our 91st quiet fact, the profound, emotional recognition of the unique northern light. For months, they had sailed under the harsh, blinding glare of the open sun or the suffocating grey of the ocean fogs. But as they crossed back into the waters of their homeland, the very quality of the light began to change. In the high latitudes of the north, the sun sits lower in the sky, casting a deeply angled, incredibly soft, and golden illumination that seems to linger for hours in a state of perpetual twilight. A sailor standing at the rail would watch the ocean water transition from the deep, unfamiliar indigo of the open sea back to the rich, dark slate grey and deep moss green of their coastal waters. The sunlight did not pierce this water. It reflected off it like polished iron. Seeing this distinct, heavy, and beautiful light wash over the wooden deck was a visual homecoming, a quiet confirmation that they had crossed the invisible threshold, back into the world they knew perfectly. This return to familiar waters was quickly greeted by our 90-second detail. The sudden, sharp, and incredibly welcome cries of the coastal guardians. Out on the deep ocean, the seabirds were silent, solitary gliders, like the gannets and the albatross. But as the longship drew closer to the rocky shores of their specific fjord, the air was suddenly filled with the chaotic, swirling energy of the Arctic terns and the familiar, raucous calls of the coastal gulls. These birds did not dive silently. They screeched and chattered, circling the mast in massive, chaotic clouds, diving playfully toward the deck. To a weary sailor, this deafening, high-pitched chorus was not a nuisance. It was the joyous, chaotic music of the shoreline. The men would look up, their weathered faces breaking into wide, tired smiles, watching the white wings flash against the grey sky, knowing that these birds nested on the very cliffs that guarded their village, knowing that their journey was nearing its absolute end. The crew engaged in our 93rd quiet fact, the incredibly deliberate, almost ceremonial preparation of their appearance. The Norsemen were deeply proud people, and they refused to return to their families, looking like ragged, defeated survivors of the sea. In the calm, protected waters just outside their home fjord, the captain would order the ship to halt. the men would open the deepest, most secure corners of their wooden sea chests. They carefully pulled out their finest, cleanest garments, which had been wrapped tightly in oiled leather for the entire voyage. They stripped off their salt-stained, faded work tunics and dressed in brilliantly dyed wools of deep red and blue, often beautifully embroidered with intricate knotwork, using fine silver threads acquired in distant lands. They used their precious fresh water to meticulously wash their faces, and they spent hours using their bone combs to untangle and braid their long hair and beards. When they finally took to the oars again, they had transformed from weathered ocean wanderers into prosperous, dignified merchants and proud warriors, ready to present themselves to their community with honor and grace. This transformation of the men was mirrored by the transformation of the ship itself, leading to our 94th fascinating detail: the silent raising of the wooden beast. Throughout the vast majority of their open ocean voyage, the iconic, terrifying carved wooden dragon head did not sit upon the prow of the ship. The Norsemen believed the fierce visage would frighten away the protective nature spirits of the open water, so it was carefully detached and stored safely in the hold. But now, as they prepared to enter their home waters and announce their triumphant return, it was time to awaken the dragon. Two of the strongest sailors would carefully lift the heavy, masterfully carved oak head from its resting place. Moving to the very front of the ship, they would slide the intricately carved neck onto the soaring wooden prow, securing it tightly with heavy wooden pegs. As the fierce, snarling wooden face locked into place, staring proudly over the water, a profound silence would fall over the crew. The ship was no longer just a merchant vessel seeking safe passage. It was a proud, triumphant creature of the north, fully armed and ready to glide victoriously into its home port. As the newly crowned ship sliced through the calm water, entering the deep, winding channel of their home fjord, we discover our 95th quiet fact: the deeply comforting, familiar acoustic signature of the stone walls. Every fjord in the north possesses a slightly different shape, and therefore a completely unique echo. For the seasoned navigator, seeing the mountains was not enough. He needed to hear them. As the men rowed, the rhythmic, heavy splash of the long ash oars striking the water would bounce off the towering, sheer granite cliffs on either side. The sound would return to the ship as a deep, hollow, rolling echo. The captain would close his eyes, listening to the precise delay and the specific pitch of the returning sound. He knew every bend, every hidden cove, and every narrowing of the channel, entirely by the way the stone sang back to the ship. It was an auditory map that he had memorized since childhood, a dark, echoing lullaby that guided the massive wooden vessel flawlessly through the winding shadows of the deep stone valley. Drifting quietly through that echoing valley brings us to our 96th sleepy detail: the invisible, aromatic welcome that arrived long before the village could even be seen. As the longship rounded the final, massive bend in the fjord, the wind shifted slightly, rolling gently down from the high valleys. Before the first wooden roof or smoking chimney came into view, the scent of the settlement washed completely over the deck. It was the rich, heavy, incredibly complex smell of home. The men would stop rowing for just a moment, taking a deep, collective breath of the twilight air. They could smell the distinct, sweet smoke of burning birch wood from dozens of hearth fires, the sharp, earthy scent of peat burning in the blacksmith's forge, and the faint, mouth-watering aroma of roasting meats and baking barley bread, preparing for the evening meal. This invisible wave of domestic scents enveloped the tired sailors, instantly washing away the sharp, biting memories of the freezing ocean salt, replacing their sea weariness with a profound, quiet surge of adrenaline and an overwhelming, tearful sense of belonging, as they prepared to pull the oars for the very last time. As they pulled those oars for the final time, breaking the glassy surface of the water, we reach our 97th quiet fact, the profound, hushed reverence of the waiting village. The people on the shore did not jump, scream, or sound blaring horns as the great wooden dragon emerged from the evening mist. Life in the north was intimately tied to the brutal realities of the sea, and a returning ship was treated with the deep, quiet respect of a granted prayer. As the longship glided toward the wooden docks, the women, children, and elders walked slowly down to the water's edge, holding small, flickering torches of pine resin that cast warm, dancing reflections on the dark water. They stood close together in the twilight, their eyes scanning the deck in absolute silence, searching the tired, bearded faces for their husbands, fathers, and sons. The only sounds were the soft, rhythmic dipping of the oars, the gentle creaking of the wooden hull, and the soft crackle of the torches, a silent, breathtaking moment of anticipation that hung heavy and beautiful in the cold night air. When the heavy oak hull finally nudged against the wooden pilings of the dock, bringing the epic voyage to a complete and final halt, we witness our 98th detail, the incredibly physical, wordless nature of their reunions. The men did not immediately shout tales of their adventures, or brag of the wealth hidden within their sea chests. They simply laid down their heavy ash oars, climbed slowly over the wooden rail, and stepped onto the solid earth. When a sailor found his family in the soft torchlight, the embrace was silent, fierce, and desperately tight. A weathered, calloused hand would gently stroke a child's hair, and faces would press deeply into woolen shoulders, breathing in the scent of the hearth and the home. The overwhelming relief of survival was too immense, too profound for simple words. The tears that fell in the shadows of the dock were quiet tears, a pure, physical release of the immense tension they had carried across 1,000 miles of deadly, unpredictable ocean. Leaving the cold dock behind, the men walked up the hill to experience our 99th sleepy fact, the overwhelming sensory comfort of the great longhouse. Stepping through the heavy wooden doors, the sailors were enveloped in a world they had dreamed of during their freezing nights on the open deck. The longhouse was a cavern of warmth, dominated by a massive, roaring fire in the central stone hearth that cast a brilliant, dancing golden light across the soot-blackened rafters. But the greatest comfort was the profound, unmoving stability of the earth beneath them. They sat heavily on wide, stationary wooden benches, covered in thick, dry sheepskins, marveling at the simple reality that the floor was not pitching violently beneath their feet. As they ate hot, roasted meats and drank sweet, honeyed mead from polished horns, the warmth of the fire slowly baked the lingering ocean dampness from their bones. The heavy, insulated turf walls blocked out the sound of the wind entirely, wrapping the exhausted travelers in a thick acoustic blanket of absolute safety and unbreakable peace. As the feasting slowly quieted, and the sailors finally drifted into the deepest, most restorative sleep of their lives, we are left with our 100th and final quiet truth: the patient, solitary rest of the wooden beast that carried them. Down at the dark, silent dock, the great clinker-built longship floated gently on the calm water of the fjord. The massive woolen sail was tightly furled, the heavy oars rested quietly in their racks, and the carved wooden dragon head stared blindly out into the night mist. The ship was empty now, stripped of its valuable cargo and its weary crew. But it was not abandoned. It was a living, breathing creature of oak and pine, forged in the silent forests and tempered by the brutal ocean, now resting peacefully in the protective embrace of its home waters. The gentle lapping of the tiny waves against the wooden hull sounded like a slow, contented breathing, a quiet lullaby for the magnificent wooden vessel as it slept under the watchful, glittering canopy of the northern stars. And so, our long, quiet voyage across the northern seas comes to a gentle close. We have sailed through the deep ocean fogs, listened to the songs of the melting ice, and found our way back to the warm, comforting fires of home. I hope these quiet moments of history have brought you a sense of deep peace and calm. It is time now to let go of the tiller, to let the heavy woolen sail fall, and to allow the gentle, rhythmic rocking of the sea to carry you safely into your own quiet dreams. Sleep well, and good night.